Energy Solutions Center in partnership with the United Nations Foundation Energy Access Practitioner. Today's webinar is focused on the state of play for the end of life recycling for off-grid solar e-waste. Before we begin, I'll quickly go over some of the webinar features. For audio, you'll have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over the telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. Doing so will eliminate the possibility of feedback and echo. If you choose to dial in by phone, please select the telephone option, and a box on the right side will display the telephone number and audio pin you should use to dial in. If anyone is having any technical difficulties with the webinar, you may contact the GoTo's Webinars Help Desk at 888-259-3826 for assistance. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you use the questions pane where you may type in your question. Also, the audio recording and presentations will be posted to the Solutions Center training page within a few days of the broadcast, and will be added to the Solutions Center YouTube channel, where you'll find other informative webinars as well as video interviews with thought leaders on clean energy policy topics. Finally, one important note to mention before we begin our webinar presentation is that the Clean Energy Solutions Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solutions Center resource library as one of many best practice resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. Today's webinar agenda is focused around the presentations from our guest panelists, Declan Murray, Federico Magalini, Athena Kyriakopoulou, Pragya Kanya, who have joined us to discuss the current state of sector for the end of the life strategies and recycling for electric waste for off-grid products, in particular solar PV. Before we jump into the presentations, I'd like to provide a quick overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, and Luke Saviri from the United Nations Foundation will provide a quick overview of the Energy Access Practitioners Network. Then following the panelists' presentations, we'll have a question and answer session where the panelists will address questions submitted by the audience. At the end of the webinar, you'll be automatically prompted to fill out a brief survey as well. So thank you in advance for taking a moment to respond. The Solutions Center was launched in 2011 under the Clean Energy Ministerial. The Clean Energy Ministerial is a high-level global forum to promote policies and programs that advance clean energy technology, to share lessons learned and best practices, and to encourage the transition to a global clean energy economy. 24 countries in the European Commission are members, covering 90% of the clean energy investment and 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This webinar is provided by the Clean Energy Solutions Center, which focuses on helping government policymakers design and adopt policies and programs that support the deployment of clean energy technologies. This is accomplished through support in crafting and implementing policies relating to energy access, no-cost expert policy assistance, and peer-to-peer learning and training tools such as this webinar. The Clean Energy Solutions Center is co-sponsored by the governments of Australia, Sweden, and the United States, with in-kind support from the government of Chile. The Solutions Center provides several clean energy policy programs and services, including a team of over 60 global experts that can provide remote and in-person technical assistance to government and government-supported institutions, no-cost virtual webinar trainings on a variety of clean energy topics, partnership building with the development agencies and regional and global organizations to deliver support, and an online library containing over 5,500 clean energy policy-related publications, tools, videos, and other resources. Our primary audience is made up of energy policymakers and analysts from governments and technical organizations within countries, but we also strive to engage with the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. The Solutions Center is an international initiative that works with more than 35 international partners across its suite of different programs. Several of the partners are listed above include research organizations like IRENA and the IEA, and programs like SE for All, and regional focus entities such as EcoWatt, the Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. A marquee feature of the Solutions Center provides is a no-cost expert policy assistance known as Ask an Expert. The Ask an Expert service matches policymakers with more than 60 global experts selected as authoritative leaders on specific clean energy, finance, and policy topics. For example, in the area of off-grid solutions, we are very pleased to have Hugo Lucas, head of the Energy Department at Factor CO2, serving as one of our experts. If you have a need for policy assistance in off-grid solutions or any other clean energy sector, we encourage you to use this valuable service. Again, this assistance is provided free of charge. If you have a question for our experts, please submit it through our simple online format, cleanenergysolutions.org/expert. We also invite you to spread the word about this service to those in your networks and organizations. Today's webinar is co-moderated by Luke Saveri, who is the manager at UN Foundation's Energy Access activities, focusing primarily on the energy access gap in the health sector. And now I'd like to provide brief introductions for today's panelists. First up today is Declan Murray, who's in his final year of a PhD in International Development at the University of Edinburgh. His research looks at the repair of off-grid solar products by users, independent repair technicians, and companies. Following Declan, we will hear from Federico Magalini, who is the Managing Director at Sophie's UK. In the past 15 years, he's focused in his research and consultancy on e-waste management and industry efficiency. Following Federico, we will hear from Athena Kirikopoulou, who is the CEO and founder of Phoenix Recycling, an integrated waste management company offering solutions to industries such as off-grid solar. And our final speaker today is Pragya Khanna, who is the head of corporate social responsibilities at Philip Lighting. And with those brief introductions, I'd like to welcome Luke to the webinar. Luke?
Thank you so much, Katie. Let me open up my presentation. There we go. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Luke Saveri. I work at the UN Foundation, working on our energy access portfolio. I would like to welcome you all to our final webinar of what has been another positive year for energy access and SDG 7.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. My apologies for interrupting. We're able to see the go-to webinar bar if you just want to minimize that with the orange button. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the reminder. So welcome again to our final webinar of what has been a very positive year for energy access, for renewable energy, for energy efficiency, and for everything that Sustainable Development Goal 7 stands for. Today, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what to date has been, I would say, a somewhat underserved and under-highlighted topic, namely that of end-of-life strategies and recycling for off-grid energy products. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by 4 excellent speakers. We really wanted to touch on this topic this year still, because we feel like there's been a growing awareness of the potential impact, both environmental and on health, that e-waste can have in rural communities, and that includes both the e-waste that we're all aware of, the ICT e-waste, but also on the off-grid energy products, in particular looking at lead acid batteries. And in the last few years, in big workshops, whenever we have a lot of distributors and retailers in the group, I've always tried to bring up this issue where I always make the same statement, namely that lead acid batteries, lead is one of the most toxic metals in the world, and acid is not a party drug. So we definitely need to find better solutions to take care of what is potentially an environmental and a health disaster. But before we dive in, let me just provide you with a quick introduction to the Energy Access Practitioner Network, which is housed here within the United Nations Foundation. The EAPN was established in 2011 to support the global momentum to achieve energy access for all, as it is now also captured under Sustainable Development Goal 7. We do this by connecting our 2,500 members, who now collectively represent about 1,350 organizations, all active in the energy access space, by connecting them to information, knowledge, resources, tools, and probably most importantly to very powerful partnerships. And in doing so, we are aiming to unify the sector, to accelerate learnings across actors, countries, and technologies, and lastly, also to elevate the issue of energy access on the global agenda, for example, as a key supporter of sustainable energy for all. On this slide, you see you have an overview of how we work, but let me just highlight two examples of work we've done this year. So firstly, in recent years, we've been carrying out an annual survey across our membership to capture market intelligence, to capture sector trends, and you can expect the results of our last survey, which we carried out over the summer months earlier this year, in the first part of 2018. So definitely something to look forward to. Secondly, this year we organized and supported several country-level events. For example, in June, we organized a last-mile distribution workshop for distributors and retailers of off-grid products in Tanzania in particular, which is where this issue of last-mile distribution, we try to start the conversation of turning it around and talking about first-mile recovery, first mile logistics as it relates to recycling and end of life strategies. And just 2 weeks ago, we were part of the organizing committee for the SAFE workshop, which looks at safe access to fuel and energies, or in other words, the intersection of energy access and humanitarian responses. And during this workshop, we also organized a side event looking specifically at the appropriateness and the opportunities for mini grids and hybrid energy solutions in refugee camp settings, which really brought together both the energy community and the humanitarian response community. But enough about that. Back to the topic of the day: end-of-life strategies and recycling for off-grid energy products. We encourage you all to follow the conversation, to contribute to the conversation on social media. We're using the hashtag PN webinar, which stands for Practitioner Network webinar, and definitely follow our Twitter handle at Energy Access PN. Again, the PN stands, of course, for Practitioner Network, for both live updates of this webinar, but also following the webinar, we'll do a quick recap in terms of what the main lessons learned have been, or what we're taking away from this webinar and beyond. So without further ado, I would like to first, of course, pass controls back to Katie, and then I believe Declan Murray will kick off the presentations.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview, Luke. Yes, we will be now hearing from Declan Murray. Declan? Declan, I believe that your phone might be on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So hi, everyone. Thanks, Luke, and thank you, Stephanie, for the introductions, and also for your hard work in putting this together. I know that for Luke especially, this has been something he's wanted to get a webinar together on for a while. Really looking forward to the discussion, and then hopefully for some good questions after the presentations. So over the next few minutes, I just want to make one point, really, or try to, and that is that repair is a form of waste management. Not only that, but I would argue it's a quicker, lower cost, and less energy intensive strategy than recycling. Although I do want to stress that even repair needs that final safety net that recycling offers, particularly for batteries. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Athena can tell us about that. So since 2014, I've spent 18 months in Kenya collecting the data for my PhD. And in that time, my fieldwork split over 3 sites, drawing on 3 main research methods. First, I worked in an independent electronic repair clinic, observing how the existing electronic repair economy works in the country. Secondly, I surveyed users of solar products and asked them about their understandings and attitudes towards e-waste management at home. And the third site of my research was the offices and warehouses of various manufacturers and distributors of off-grid solar products. There, I interviewed employees about the company warranty and disposal practices. But rather than bombard you with all of that, I'm going to tell you just one story of a customer who came to the repair clinic where I was working, and he brought in the panel for his Niwa solar lantern. It was the Niwa Multi 300. So in February 2016, the panel that charges Martin's Niwa, Martin was the customer who came into the clinic, was blown off of the roof of his house in high winds. Afterwards, he noticed that his lantern was no longer working. He could see that there was no visible damage to the panel itself, so he concluded that the problem must be in the cable connecting the panel to the lantern. In order to get a new cable, he decided to take the panel to our clinic in town, a 15-minute motorbike ride from his house. When he arrived, Wilson, my mentor and boss in the clinic, sent Martin across the road to buy a new cable from a phone accessories shop. Knowing it wasn't a difficult job to take the plug from the original cable and attach it to the new one, as we see in this slide here, Martin waited while we connected the new cable and tested it. And so in the end, Martin had paid about $1, the equivalent of $1 to get the cable replaced and to get his lantern working again. Around about a week later, I visited Martin at home, where he showed me the roof that his panel had fallen off. And I was surprised to see something else on the roof, and he explained how after leaving the clinic, he had gone to a friend across town who was a welder and got him to make a steel frame to hold this panel that you see on your screens onto the roof. Martin also showed me a couple of other solar lanterns he uses. He charges off of chairs outside his house in order to keep them out of the wind, although he did say he was worried that his children might knock these ones off. And then in December of last year, I spent a day in the workshop of the distributor of Martin's product in Kenya. So Niwa, the company in this particular instance, I don't have a kind of technical presence in the country, and that role is performed by a distributor called Solitech, who are based in Mombasa. So during my day with Ben, one of the products we worked on was a Niwa. It was also a Niwa product. It was a Niwa Home 200. So after some preliminary tests outside, Benson decided that, again, the problem was with the cable connecting the panel to the battery unit you see sat in the shade in that image. However, unlike Martin or Wilson in the clinic, Benson had access to a stock of replacement cables from the manufacturer, from Niwa themselves. But these still didn't work, so then Benson turned up to opening up the panel itself. Unfortunately, Benson didn't have the hex screwdriver that you need to open this panel, so he was improvising with a regular flat screwdriver. Anyway, after multiple other attempts trying new panels, new cables, and other things, Benson conceded defeat and said that the customer of this particular product would receive a whole new a replacement product. I have dozens of other stories from my research like Martin's, and I've no doubt that there are hundreds of thousands of them across Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa and other countries in the global south. For Martin, the repair at the clinic where I was working was possible because all he needed was a new cable. Had his battery been the problem, as is most common with these products, there would have been little we could have done for him. In terms of strategies to support repair as waste management, we need to look at providing replacement parts, at very least replacement batteries. Also, I should stress that Martin is a bit of an exception. The fact that he knew that the cable was the problem and took it to town and then even went a step further than that, the preventive action to now attach his panel into a frame on his roof, really stands him apart from other users that I've interacted and we spoke to in my survey, where most people are just holding on to their faulty or broken products at home. So again, if we're looking to think about strategies for using repair as a tool, as a device in waste management, then I wonder if we might look to the existing repair network, as Martin did, especially to help those users who are less technically literate than Martin was. And then finally, to move from Martin's home to the Solitech workshop in Mombasa, get it repaired and returned would have taken something like 80 hours at least. That's about 3.5 days. But if there are repair clinics with the knowledge and the resources to repair products within 15 minutes of Martin's house, to me, it's little wonder that he chose to void his warranty and pursue that that closer service. Even less so when, in the particular incident I've relayed to you now with Benson, he was the kind of verified or designated technician, was unable to repair the product on that day that I was with him. So just to conclude, really, as we move through the rest of the webinar and indeed beyond, I'd invite you all to think about product breakdown or failure, not necessarily as the end of life, but rather as the end of one life. So in giving products a new life through repair, like Martin did, I believe we can let our actions defend solar as a green technology and not just our words. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Declan. Next, we would like to welcome Federico to the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. I thank you all for organizing, Luke and Stephanie for organizing this webinar. Do you see my screen correctly?
Yes, it looks wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I can start. I will try to stay within these 10 minutes, and sorry if I'm speaking sometimes too quickly, trying to channel as much message as I can. I think there is no need to recall the large benefits of off-grid solar products in Africa and in Asia, but as Declan said, those products might go through different stages of first life, second life, third life. We know repair is pretty much advanced in Africa and Asia in particular, but sooner or later they are reaching the end of life, and then there is mainly no other option than proper recycling. And I think when it comes to the end of life of electronic products, we have at least 4 areas where we can see certain impact. Of course, off-grid solar, they have an impact on e-waste. They are part of the so-called e-waste streams. The impact is not major. Of course, we have a lot of off-grid solar being spread across Africa and Asia, but if you consider also other electronic products, there is not products that are having a greater impact, but definitely they are an enabling factor for the consumption of other electronic products like radio, fans, refrigerators, water pumps, and so on. So their contribution, their indirect contribution, might be a little bit higher. They have an impact on the environment at the end of life because there are a few elements of environmental concerns. We already mentioned batteries, lead acid batteries, but we have also lithium phosphate batteries, and they have an impact. They will have an impact on finances because when we move along with policies and based on extended producer responsibility, they are having an impact because we need finance. So we will see later on how much money we might need to pull or to inject into the system, and definitely they will have an impact on policy and legislation because we will have sooner or later to set up proper legal framework for ensuring a proper take back of electronic products, including off-grid solar products. Of course, when we compare to the other type of electronic products or other devices, as you can see, off-grid solar have their own, let's say, peculiarities. They are usually very, let's say, low in terms of size and weight. If we are speaking about solar portable lighting, and the more we move towards solar home system, of course, the weight and the size is increasing. The environmental and their concern when it comes to the end of life, I would say is medium to high, especially for some components. And when we look at the intrinsic economic value of the material contained in these products is not that high, meaning that we might need to, as I said earlier, inject some money into the system. But this table show you or what need. I want to channel one important message with this table, that even if we speak about electronic products in general, different waste streams have different priorities and different peculiarities. In this table, I just want to connect together two important dimensions: the economic dimension, which is the vertical axis of these metrics, and the environmental dimension. So we know in this matrix, we have the area of profit, which is the top of the matrix. We have the area of losses, which is the lower part of the matrix, and we have the environmental, let's say, gain. So a good thing for the environment on the right, and the environmental burden or the bad thing for the environment on the left of the table. And as you can see, if we could just try to visualize the different electronic products on this matrix, you have something like this. And if you put off-grid solar, we are more or less in the lower corner of the matrix, meaning that if you look at the products alone, there is not enough economic value into the products to ensure proper recycling. And this is again another way to say, if we want to have environmental benefit, if we want to have a proper recycling, then we need to inject some money into the system, because otherwise proper recycling operation cannot happen. And of course, when we use the word off-grid solar, again is one word, but behind one word we have very different products. We go from solar portable lighting up to solar home system, and sometimes connected to solar home system we have different devices, and depending on the device connected, the story, the end of life impact is different. Here you can see the data from a report we did for the FID last year already. You see the baseline of electronic products placed on market in 14 African countries, the blue bar, and the red is more or less the estimation of the resulting electronic waste. And then here you see the green is the put on the market of off-grid solar, and then the resulting waste. But as you can see, there is an order of magnitude in the scale. So as I said earlier, the impact of end-of-life electronic products coming from off-grid solar is let's say is minimal, or it's lower compared to the it's not let's say it's not mainstream. We are ranging between 0.5, which is more or less the same impact as mobile phones, up to 3.5%, depending on the type of batteries used in solar home system. If you're speaking about light lithium phosphate batteries, or if you're speaking about the more heavier lead acid batteries. So that's to give you an idea of the impact in terms of volume. And as I said earlier, depending on the perspective we want to take, again, the different products or their components are playing a different role. As you can see, we have when we look at the presence of toxic potentially hazardous components, luckily compact fluorescent lamps containing mercury were phased out because off-grid solar moved much quicker to LED lamps. But we might have some metals like cadmium and tellurium used in PV modules, as we might have some lead and cadmium in batteries. But there are also relevant material from a resource management perspective, like rare earth used in LED, or material that are having relevant disposal costs, like the plastic containing brominated flame retardants, compact fluorescent lamp, if any, containing mercury, the lithium phosphate batteries, and so on. As you can see, some metals or some components are in different part of the table, and this is also why we need to really look carefully into what we are doing, because, for instance, lead is at the same time very hazardous, but is also having a very high economic value. So proper recycling can happen and can compensate the cost of properly recycling other materials, and so on. So again, one of the message, when we look at the end of life, there is not necessarily one single solution or one single perspective we need to take. Sometimes we need to account the different perspective, because there are a lot of interconnection between environment, economic, and societal elements. We know that in Africa we have local markets for some of the fractions that are resulting from the processing of the off-grid, and I really like when Declan said we need to have a safety net for proper recycling. This is exactly what we need to develop. So we have local markets for steel, copper, aluminum, in some cases plastics, but we don't have local market. We don't have recycling infrastructure for many of the fractions that are resulting from the proper treatment of end-of-life off-grid solar, like lithium phosphate batteries, sometimes lead battery as well, LAD, plastic containing from brominated flame retardants, or printed circuit boards. This is why we really need to develop solutions that are coping with these needs. As you can see, this is the best link to my next slides. Some of the key components of the off-grid solar products are having a very negative value, means that if we want to have a proper recycling, we need to pay. Now, we did back in 2016 the first study for DFID. There are other two reports we have done recently, one focusing on Kenya, one focusing on Rwanda, but they are not yet public domain. But the methodology, the results of the first study has been used in the second one, so we can look at the results, and it's more or less channeling the same message. As you can see, we did some case studies in Rwanda, in Kenya, in Nigeria at that time, and we tried to model the proper cost for end-of-life management of off-grid solar products, looking at off-grid solar portable lighting, so-called PC1, up to solar home systems, so-called PC4. And as you can see, the matrix, it's mainly containing red numbers, meaning that we have cost. Under some scenario, I can tell you, for solar home system, so PC4, we might have some black popping in, meaning that the value of the copper cables and eventually the value of the lead acid batteries can eventually compensate some of the disposal of other fractions, but still access to waste, collection, transportation is always a cost. So depending on where we are in Africa, depending on local markets, the impacts in terms of proper recycling, it's around let's say 0.5 euro per product up to 1 euro per product. And as you can see, this is translated into 0.5, 1, 2% of the market price. And this table is of course excluding the potential cost of the first mile collection, meaning the potential cost that one person maybe is bearing when traveling from a very rural area to the first point where he can drop off a product. That might be $1-2 per product, but if it's a solar portable lighting, so a product of 200 grams, 300 grams, the impact in euro per ton of that first mile collection is massive. So this is why I think we really need to develop a common and smart solution. We propose already in the first report some action items, developing toolkit for end-of-life management of off-grid solar products, carry out some pilot projects. I have to say, since I joined, let me say, this community, or I started working with companies in the off-grid solar sector, I'm really happy because I've seen a lot of good ideas, a lot of proactiveness. So I'm really looking forward to see much more solution implemented on the ground. And I'm sure that Athena, after me, can really bring some more positive message into the arena. So wonderful. I hope I met in the time. So hand over to the next speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Federico. We would now like to welcome Athena to the webinar. Athena, are you there? We are not getting any sound. Athena, can you try again? We're not able to hear you.
Is this working at all? Hi.
Oh, yes, yes. Maybe if you're on a
Great.
headset, move the mic closer to your mouth.
How does that sound?
Oh, beautiful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming to today's webinar. Thank you to Federico, Declan, and the rest of the presenters and organizers for organizing this. It's a really important topic. I'd like now to present a more practical perspective. As Phoenix Recycling is an e-waste recycling company in Tanzania and East Africa, and I want to share with you some of the challenges of implementing all the great theory that we've just discussed. So in Tanzania, we have about 26,000 tons of e-waste produced per year, estimated. To give you a little bit of perspective on what that means, that's the equivalent to the weight of all the elephants in the Serengeti. As Federico mentioned, about 3% of this, 3 to 4%, is from off-grid solar. So that's approximately 1,000 tons of direct solar systems, plus all the indirect appliances, TVs, radios, fridges, etc. So it's not a significant portion of the e-waste problem, but it is a significant problem. E-waste in general is very difficult to deal with for a variety of reasons. First of all, specific e-waste regulation doesn't exist in East Africa. There are draft e-waste regulations in Kenya and Rwanda, but they're still being discussed. Tanzania and Uganda are in the process of creating drafts. So it's unclear for companies exactly what their obligations are, and it's unclear for regulators how to enforce responsible waste management with regards to e-waste. There's obviously environmental issues with e-waste, both dumping as well as informal recycling. The finances around e-waste without clear regulation are very cloudy. Some people feel they should sell their e-waste. Other people, e-waste recyclers, as Federico mentioned, we would like to be paid to recycle it. So that is a contentious issue. There's also lack of expertise. A lot of people don't understand or don't have the knowledge to properly manage e-waste. And finally, one of the biggest problems is logistics. There just isn't the capacity here for e-waste recycling. It's estimated that the amount of e-waste in the region and globally grows 33% every year. This might grow even faster because East Africa is a developing region. So Phoenix Recycling is here to provide businesses and organizations with easy and responsible recycling solutions to help solve this crisis and to deal with the challenges that were discussed earlier in this webinar. What Phoenix Recycling provides is a variety of services and benefits to help address all the challenges with dealing with e-waste. So we provide simple door-to-step collection. We come to your hub, to your offices to collect whatever waste you have. We ensure that you're meeting all the environmental health and safety standards according to international best practice. We obtain all the permits and provide advice on the regulatory requirements for your business, as well as give you an insight into the discussions around draft regulation and what's coming down the line, so companies are not taken by surprise. We also deal with a variety of different waste streams, so you don't have to worry about sorting it. And then we provide a simple per kilo price structure. So we analyze the waste a business has and we provide them a flat fee. This can be per kilo or per system to help them be able to translate those disposal costs back into their business modeling, budgeting, and projections. We work with a variety of partners, both locally and across the region, including off-grid solar companies like Mobisol and Phoenix International. Our business model is quite simple. What we do is we collect solar components from the businesses themselves. We bring it to our dismantling center where we do manual or mechanical dismantling and processing of the components. Essentially, we take it apart with a screwdriver, and then we sell the various components both internationally and locally. As Federico mentioned, downstream off-takers and recyclers don't exist for some of the fractions like lithium batteries and PWB. So that's in theory, it's a very high-level overview of what Phoenix Recycling does and provides to businesses in the off-grid solar sector. But I'd like to share with you some of the challenges involved with growing this industry for both the off-grid sector companies as well as Phoenix Recycling. The first is that one solar home system does not mean one solar home system. So for instance, Mobisol just celebrated their 500,000th sale of a solar home system. That does not mean that there's going to be 500,000 solar home systems that are going to need recycling, because over the lifetime of these products, that one system that is sold compromises of various replacement components. As Declan mentioned, a lot of cables are replaced, lights are often replaced, sometimes batteries are swapped, TVs might break, and even solar panels might be replaced, depending if they break or crack. There's a huge discrepancy between the technical and commercial lifespan of these products. So technically in a lab, a solar panel should last 25 years, LEDs might last 3 to 5 years, charging cables should last even up to 1 to 3 years. However, in the field and in the rough conditions that these products are being put out into, there's often an early rate of disposal. And a lot of this also happens for operational reasons. So if a company who sells a solar lantern discontinues a certain line of product, then that entire line of product will need to be disposed of because they can't push that product into the market anymore. They can't reuse it and they can't use it as spares. So it's not just how long should a solar home system or lantern technically last. Operationally is another question. I wanted to touch base on what Federico also discussed, is the cost of recycling. So a lot of the questions we hear from businesses is, how much will you buy my waste for? There is a perception that e-waste is valuable and should therefore be bought. But I'd like to look at an example case of a solar home system, which consists of a plastic casing, a lithium battery, a circuit board, and dismantling time. Now, these are, of course, this is just a gross simplification, but it gives us an idea here that if we look at the average value per kilo, plus the weight of that product, we get a negative value for the entire system. And this, although the circuit boards and the plastic casings may bring in some revenue, and even the aluminum frames for the panels, the cost of disposing for a lithium battery, the dismantling time, transportation costs, getting the difficult components to green recyclers internationally, all of this means that ultimately the solar home system companies need to pay for the disposal of their product. In the region in East Africa right now, I mentioned that there are not a lot of e-waste recyclers. There are 5 at the moment, including Phoenix Recycling. There's 1 per each East African region. Phoenix operates across the region. So rather than being a geographical e-waste recycler, we go where the businesses require us. Some of these e-waste recyclers have high health and safety standards. Other ones do not. The customer service of some of the players has also been questionable, and even if you take all 5 of them together, their capacity is not enough to deal with the e-waste problem in East Africa. All 5 companies are going to need to grow significantly, and we might see more players on the market in order to handle all of the e-waste in the region. So why does this affect you, my listeners? It's very important to ask the question, where does my waste go? It is not only an environmental problem. The environmental and safety impacts of all waste, including off-grid solar waste, is incredibly important. As Federico mentioned, we are looking at a crisis, particularly with lead-acid batteries. Regulatory requirements will come into place, and as a business and as an industry sector, we need to be prepared for it, because otherwise it can cripple us. There is a cost to responsible management of waste, and that's something that needs to be incorporated into budgeting and financial projections. But most importantly for me is the brand risk exposure. If the off-grid solar sector doesn't responsibly choose its waste management partners, it's risking breaking trust with its customers. If a customer goes and buys a solar lantern from a third party that was sourced from an improper e-waste recycler, he or she will not differentiate that from buying it directly from the company itself. And often, if these products, which were meant for recycling, get resold, they're not to the quality standards that are being marketed. And this leads to a loss of trust with customers, which can quickly spread to genuine customers. So it's not only an environmental problem, it's not only a regulatory problem, it's also a business issue in terms of choosing your responsible waste management partner. So thank you all for listening. You can find out more at our website and our Instagram, or get in touch directly. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Athena. Now we would like to go to Pragya. Wonderful. We can see your screen. Wonderful. I believe you're still on mute. If you can unmute.
Yes, clearly have been on mute for a while. Very interesting to once again listen to some of our colleagues and peers here, Federico and Declan and Athena. Great setting the scene. So from a Philips Lighting Foundation perspective, I just wanted to give a bit of the macro picture from our side on, because from our perspective, where our vision and mission is on enabling access to light. Sorry, is there a way of making this, bear with me. It's not moving to the next slide. Is there anything that I need to do? Yeah, it's there. Super. Our vision and mission is to enable access to light, and which by default also means access to energy. And again, by default, we're working in specific geographies that you're looking at, Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, primarily. A lot of emphasis also in India. For this, what we've done is really mapped out the value chain, not the reverse logistics, but the first, even just getting into the last mile distribution and last mile penetration of solar lighting products, which in itself, as you can, anybody, all my peers in the call over here will understand, is a big challenge. And there are many barriers already to getting the products out there. So clearly there would be larger barriers also to getting the products back in. The approach that we take as a foundation is to try and take the pressure off, the financial pressure off, and the piloting pressure off the various companies that are out there bringing the product into the last mile, for them to take the responsibility at this stage already, when they're trying to survive in very meager circumstances, for their in trying to get a commercial value proposition already existing, right pricing structures, ensuring their financial viability in this state. So we as a foundation are focusing a lot on piloting, enabling local technical development of various, not just the training capacity for processing of recycling of solar e-waste management, but also enabling transfer of knowledge from what Athena was also touching upon before, on where you're shipping a lot of your recycled elements to internationally, where there are international standard recognized recycling agencies, which increases the cost of the recycling in total. So our approach primarily has been to try and break down the silos across the sector, try and bring together, map all the various initiatives and pilots, because there's very little and far between that is happening. You know, you saw on this last slide of Athena, but there is a lot of learning that we can have together to enable the volumes to be to enable the Athena's business to be a commercial success. You need to be able to service many. And where does the pricing, for example, need to be built in? Is it the product that that the producer and the manufacturer is bringing in? Does the distributor share some of the burden? Do we also bring in the burden onto the customer? So all that thinking, specifically as we are so strongly affiliated to Philips Lighting, which has its own manages its own solar products portfolio. And there are many, there are many different models that we could possibly experiment with to see exactly how we can take that burden off, or at least create already the pricing structure where the cost of that recycling or responsible end-of-life management disposal is built into the cost of the product. So our approach is to learn, to deep dive, see what is happening. There's some pilots are happening in India. There are some pilots happening in Africa. Federico is, being just done the workshops in Rwanda, in Kenya, and then to strategize, try and bring together the various enablers, the actors in this end-of-life value chain, and to try and bring multi-purpose financing together towards bringing pilots into the space that you can test and model across the various geographies, bring best practice from one geography to another geography. Once there are some pilots that actually are proven as successful, that we can again lead and influence and try and enable, whether it's the regulatory frameworks, whether it's sharing best practice, enabling industry standards in this very nascent industry electronically, and then of course pioneer the pilots and try and scale and understand what are the resources that are required to that will enable us to overcome the barriers to scale as well. And it's a circle that we have to keep going around. This is a small snapshot of what would be in any electronic e-waste management, all the various opportunities to be able to have responsible end of life, and how the product would possibly flow into various secondary markets. And this is how this just demonstrates all the various pilots that can be, and what various solutions can be applicable across different geographies and contexts. In a country like Tanzania, which is far less densely populated, bringing back reverse logistics is far more complicated than a country like Bangladesh, which is extremely densely populated, and it takes away some of the other pain points that you would experience in Tanzania, for example. And there are very different, there are already different levels of maturity in e-waste management across these geographies as well. For example, in India, there's already a more, it's more advanced. There is a lot of regulatory pressure. So for lead bulb recycling, for example, it's mandatory for all producers to be taking back their lead bulb recycling. Can we already leverage those existing collection points for the same purpose of bringing back solar lighting? So there's a lot of various opportunities out there as well. We've raised all the challenges, but lots of opportunities there as well. I think the biggest differentiator and the approach and the vision that we take from the Philips Lighting Foundation is to enable local to local servicing. The idea of actually shipping products, elements away back into Belgium or to other parts of the world for processing is just purely adding to the cost, and it's absolutely unnecessary. So starting actually from even processing the product in the local market to actually making sure that disposal is also done according to the international standards. This can be enabled. It just needs to have the transfer of technology, transfer of knowledge. All these various barriers can also be individually addressed. If you have a large problem, and if you confront the entire e-waste problem of solar industry, it becomes big. But if you break it down into specific smaller problems and set into place there are enablers and actors who can take on the chunks. You have all the advocacy agencies that can take on some of the sensitization that needs to be done. Can we also leverage on the logistics existing in this space to take on the task of bringing on a reverse logistics proposition? And across the various geographies, doing various pilots and keeping the momentum going with the aim of enabling a completely locally driven solution for this problem. And one of the key things that we're looking at doing in the future is also working with the research teams, both in-house within Philips Lighting, because we have the opportunity to look at their expertise on is repair, recycling, is there anything in between that we are looking at also doing? Is it possible? One of our researchers has been talking about not waiting for the product to be 100% dead, but to try and intervene and at 70% before it's fully end of life to try and convert that into a secondary product. So there's pilots that they're building into there. Can we create, as Athena is also doing, bringing the solution, the recycling solution to where the business is, and we create mobile recycling and processing plants that can go from city to city to service various distributors. And piloting all of these in the coming months and years, together with the experience of our peers in this call. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists for the outstanding presentations. As we shift to the discussion, I would just like to remind our attendees to please submit questions using the question pane at any time. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Luke to have a discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for great presentations, for really showing what's already happening, but definitely also highlighting some of the challenges that currently exist in trying to find or trying to work towards solutions. So I guess my first question for you is, and this is for all four of you, what do you see as the single most critical barrier holding back further action or action at a wider scale? Let's just answer this in the order that you presented. So maybe Declan, can you just give a quick sense, like what do you see as the single most critical barrier holding back these solutions?
Thanks, Luke. Great question. I think it's, from my perspective and experience, it's actually acknowledging it, and I think we're well on the way to doing that. Just in the kind of 3-year journey that I've been researching and thinking about these kind of questions, more and more people have been thinking about it, getting involved, and starting to investigate it. So then I guess the follow-on to that is, how do we get more people to acknowledge it? And I think Federico in his presentation gave us a great kind of discussion of it, and Athena mentioned it as well, which is the problem is that next to regular e-waste, this might be a very small percentage, and the other challenge being that it's very dispersed, so it's actually quite hidden. If we look to how action was or is being taken towards regular or mainstream e-waste products, part of it was to do with some of these exposés from CNN or Greenpeace, where we found huge sites of unhealthy informal recycling of products, and that's not going to happen with these off-grid solar products when they're actually dotted around in people's drawers and houses around the place. So I think, yeah, the barrier for me is acknowledging that it's an issue that we need to be taking action, and then of course, how do we get everyone to acknowledge it when it's actually still quite a small fraction, but it's the main thing that makes it unique and a kind of intractable challenge is the fact that it's very dispersed. It's not centralized in these kind of urban dumps that come to mind when we think of e-waste normally.
Thanks, Declan. Federico, what's your view on this?
There are 3 main stumbling blocks or elements. The first one is that in majority of countries we do not have a legal framework for e-waste management, including the financing, which is the basic element that can eventually help or support the investment by entrepreneurs in development of the missing technical infrastructure, which is what Athena said, which is also then my second point. So in many cases, we need a little bit of development of local infrastructure, meaning recycling plant, but also options for downstream fractions to ensure we can close as much as possible material loops locally, which is in principle, let's say, the aim also of Basel Convention. And the third element, it's awareness of the people. People should be aware how to properly dispose those products, and then to, again, link to what Athena said, get in the mindset that not necessarily you need to get paid when you get rid of your products, of your waste. If it's a source of spare parts for repair, maybe that's something we can discuss, but when we are disposing something for the purpose of recycling, material recovery, you should not pretend economic compensation in the majority of cases. So these three elements: policy, recycling infrastructure, and awareness from consumers.
Athena, from your point of view as being on the ground and seeing the fractions coming in, seeing the products coming in, what do you see? What's been your biggest problem in first, maybe even in starting up your organization, and in maybe even in convincing organizations and distributors to buy into this philosophy?
I can't disagree with anything Declan or Federico said, but what I would say is the number one challenge is off-grid solar is a business. It's a fast-moving retail good and has slim profit margins and incredibly complex logistics. The issue of recycling those components, sadly, was not taken into account in the scale of those business models. It is being discussed by these companies, but incorporating it into what they're doing while reaching their rapid growth rates is an incredibly challenging issue. You have two particular challenges for these businesses to get on board with responsible recycling, and the first is the cost. With the e-waste they have, paying for that disposal is a bit of a pain for them because they haven't budgeted that cost. They haven't planned for it. It hasn't been in their investment plans. So putting that in is something they're working on, but it takes time. The second problem is, as Declan said, all of the solar products they've sold that are in the market, retrieving those. Customers, especially with lead acid-based systems, are not going to take a 40-pound battery and carry it all the way back to a shop for the pure reason of disposing it without some incentive. So how do these companies then convince their customers to bring back those components? So I think those are going to be the two biggest challenges, which translate to challenges for us, is collection and getting access to the waste.
And Pragya, from your point of view, I'd be curious to learn, what do you see as a critical barrier?
So I think, this is very, very well laid out, before me already by Declan, Federico, and Athena. However, I'd urge us to think about this, that we're working in extremely, the very fact that this is solar e-waste, it is not solar e-waste that is coming out of Berlin or in Germany. We're talking about these last mile contexts where getting the product in is already the challenge, and bringing it back out, and then all the also the related pricing structures and everything that goes around it, it's a challenge. However, it needs to be broken down into parts. Any big problem, if it's seen as a big problem, it's unsurmountable. However, if you break it down and you reach out and enable the actors who can bring solutions to each and specific, one by one, the specific parts in that problem, whether it's a customer incentivization, can we ensure that customers are given financial incentives to bring the product back? Or is there a way of ensuring if there are trucks that are going out to bring fertilizers to a certain end context, can they bring back those 40-pound batteries? And is there some logistical solution that can be built in context by context? So it's about breaking these each of these specific challenges down by one by one, and enabling the actors to do their work there to enable a robust solution. And it's not insurmountable then.
Exactly. No, thank you so much, all of you, for highlighting what there are many challenges, but it's nice to see that this is evolving and that we're seeing pockets of solutions. I think one of the another potential issue is the fact that we don't have much regulation. There's not a strong regulatory framework or any in multiple countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And the regulation that exists could potentially even harm business opportunities to come up. I'm thinking in particular of the Bamako Convention, which makes it harder to transport waste from one African country to another. So maybe for Athena, because on the slide that you showed that you're working in East Africa, how are you approaching a more regional approach, which will be absolutely necessary for multiple fractions given the low volumes, but also given the fact that we have smaller countries in the region, such as Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda, landlocked smaller countries that will have to rely on a more regional approach. So how are you approaching this, and how are you experiencing the trends? Are they positive? Is it something that you see evolving in the way that you want it to?
I would say that we're approaching it very carefully.
Yeah.
As mentioned by Federico, we have international conventions like the Basel Convention, and it was also a topic addressed at the UN Environment Assembly last week. We need to balance the need to stop hazardous waste and e-waste dumping, which is what conventions like the Basel Convention are there to do, and they're very necessary. But at the same time, ease movement of waste that is going to responsible recyclers, and that is not an easy task. So I can't say that I've seen a trend so far. I think it's too early, but it's being discussed. And transboundary movement of waste, as you said, Luke, it's necessary with small volumes, is a huge challenge as well.
Yeah, and linked to that, Federico, given that you did research over so many countries, and highlighted a couple in depth in the research that you also presented, are there any outliers or any pioneers, any champions that you've come across, either on the private sector approach in terms of the actors that are working on it, or on the more public approach in terms of regulatory framework and say extended producer responsibility schemes? Anything that stands out right now that you think could be a model for other countries?
Well, at the moment, I'm really looking forward to see how the East African community, so these 5 countries, will implement the e-waste strategy they defined and agreed on last July. And you might have seen recently Rwanda open a brand new facility that was set up by the government. Now the government handed over to a private operator to run the facility, improve the facility. And I think it's quite interesting development to see how this can move on. And I think if we create some good cases in Africa, I think would be really interesting. And I mean, I met few weeks ago Athena. I was really also impressed by their plans, what they're doing. I think it's really, I think we have few good cases. I would say few blossoms of what could be good solution, good champion in the area. Of course, we all know that 1 or 2 recyclers in a country is not enough, but if we have 1 or 2 to showcase, it will be the best proof to local governments that entrepreneurs can work, can create jobs, locally and find local solution for waste management problems. So I'm really curious to see developments in East Africa at the moment.
Yeah, great. We're all looking at what's happening with a lot of hope as well. Thanks for that, Federico. A question for Declan and Pragya. It's a topic that I think we could organize an entire webinar on, which is how can we approach this issue before it becomes one? And I'm looking more at design, I'm looking more at the repair, I'm looking at reduce before we talk about recycling. So Declan, you mentioned the story about repair clinics, about replacement parts. In your experience in Kenya in particular, how do you see this currently happening? Is this something that's being led more through the actual distributors and the manufacturers actively taking a more like a design approach to ensure that products can be repaired quickly, that spare parts are available, such as, for example, in the mobile phone sector, we have the Fairphone, which is actively trying to take that approach? Or is it really more in an informal way where it's just trying to extend the lifetime of a product?
Thanks, Vic. Yeah. Another great question. I think there's room for both. I guess what you've kind of touched on there is perhaps one earlier with product design, and you mentioned the example of Fairphone. One kind of side project that I've been involved with through my research is a website called the Off-Grid Solar Scorecard. It's the offgridsolarscorecard.com, and that website is basically just trying to push that conversation to talk about how we might better design products. So there, if you go to the website, you can take apart, disassemble a solar product, answer a series of questions about how repairable or replaceable or recyclable various components of it are, and then each product gets a ranking from A to E. So that's one way I think that we could push product design improvements. And then perhaps in the markets where we're talking, again, if you look to mobile phones, the shop where Martin went to buy that cable across the road also sells all manner of phone keyboards, phone batteries, and then you've got other shops where you're selling mobile phone smaller components like microphones and speakers. And I think a lot of that hasn't come from your phone manufacturers, but has come from the market where you've had a demand, especially in countries in the global south, where perhaps there is more of a kind of repair economy, repair culture happening. And I was last in Kenya in September and was really excited. It's not one of our certified kind of Lighting Global brands, but some of you might have come across a company called GD Light, light spelled L-I-T-E. And I found their batteries for sale. So they sell various kind of solar home systems. And for the first time I saw in Bomet, where a lot of my research has been done in Kenya, I could buy a single battery. So I'm wondering if that might even develop kind of a bit more organically the way that it has done, as more and more customers like Martin maybe are demanding, look, I want to replace the battery. And then of course we get into discussions about generic components and product designs, and there might be some confrontations to be had there. And sorry, just one last thing before I hand back, Luke, would be and Pragya mentioned doing things locally. I'm also interested to see what happens with companies like we have Forsera, who are doing they're assembling solar home systems in Kenya and in Ethiopia. And I think if we can assemble products at the beginning of life, when we reach that end of one life, it might mean that the resources, facilities, and skills that we need to get these products back to say to a company like Phoenix are already there. So yeah, I think there's optimism. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Declan. Pragya, maybe some thoughts about designing for repair as Philip's approaching it. Yep.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad, Declan, you brought this in, because I wouldn't want to steal Manav's thunder. Manav, who is head of our solar portfolio, is on the call as well, and I know that he's just launched a new product bearing very much this in mind. So Manav, are you still online? Can you share a little bit about the new design product that you brought in based on the feedback from the teams?
Yeah, thanks, Pragya. So I think I completely agree, and I think the kind of point that Declan was speaking about is some of the insight that has gone into designing a product. So while at one end we are extremely busy trying to build sustainable routes to these difficult to access markets, but I think on the other side, so while we clearly have a space shared with Pragya, where we're trying to make sure that there is a certain kind of understanding on where the Philips Lighting as a market is, as a company, is going in building business for solar products. But I think the point that we spoke about, which was on design, so what we have clearly understood, that when you take away the product, clearly the battery is one component that has a very different, I would say, life cycle, in terms of disposal vis-a-vis the other components. So we've actually tried to create, we're actually looking at creating not only a product which has a small compartment where you can change the battery. Frankly, the products are normally good for 10 or 15 years of life. The LED, the box, the components, the circuit board, nothing happens to it. So and of course it has a very different life cycle for recycling. But from the battery perspective, we're actually looking at getting the consumers to understand that you can replace a battery. We're also trying to create a complete supply chain for batteries along with the product, so that we can get access to these older batteries and then see how they go into the specific focused recycling channel. So it's not only an innovation for the consumer, which helps drive the overall cost of ownership on the access to lighting change. We also probably have a model that will help us get to do more responsible business from a recycling perspective. So these are two objectives that we are looking at entering the market. Africa, Eastern Central Africa is definitely one of the markets that you will be seeing these products very soon in. So that's my 2 pence on how we're trying to do this.
Thanks so much, Manav. Thank you for joining this call as well at the early time that it is for you right now in India. We were slowly running out of time. Also, just as a quick reminder for all the listeners, feel free to submit your questions in the chat box. We'll have a bit of time to address some of them, but those that we can't address today, we'll address at a later stage. We'll make sure that all questions get emailed to all the panelists. So feel free to engage either now or later with the panelists with your questions. I wanna ask one more question specifically for Athena, but maybe Federico wants to join in as well on the economics of it, on the costs of it. Myself, coming more from an ICT recycling point of view, the story has always been a very positive one that's been sold. Same with cell phones, that when you look at the product, there's a value to the product, which means the solution is private sector approach. It's a business approach, and while I don't disagree with it, I think there's a big caveat that we need to make here, which is that while as a whole, as Federico mentioned, some solar home systems may actually, as a whole, as a complete unit, may have some value, positive value, if you're able to get every single component. And it's that if that I just want to highlight, because solar home systems are, it's a system, it's a compilation of components, which means those components are very easy to just replace one with the other, and there's no guarantee that Athena is going to get an entire Mobisol unit. You may just get the battery, which is the cost factor, or you may just get the printed circuit board, which is the valuable one. So maybe just a quick, I wanted to make sure that we discussed this, as even if the economics as a whole give a certain picture, there's a reality that we need to take into consideration, which is the big word that we always talk about, which is cherry picking. And it's, in this case, in electronic waste, it is quite easy to cherry pick. It is easy to extract those parts, those fractions, those components that have a value, which significantly impact the bottom line companies wanting to approach e-waste as a business. Athena, what's your experience with cherry picking, with an informal sector where that often takes place, and how that's impacting, or how you're approaching organizations to make sure that that's avoided?
That's a really great question and a great point, Luke. Thank you. In general, we haven't come across a solar system in East Africa that does have a positive value. I will just put that out there because of the challenges with logistics, because of the lack of full downstream off-takers, particularly with circuit boards and batteries. Those have to be shipped outside of the continent. No solar home system has a positive value. The companies we work with and other companies we've approached are willing to pay for it, and I think they've gone through the learning exercise of realizing that their systems don't have a value, that they do need to pay for that disposal. Cherry picking is a huge problem, and the informal sector is here. It's incredibly effective in terms of collecting valuable components, and it's not something we should look at negatively. But we need to find ways of using the informal sector to collect even the non-valuable parts. That aspect of it, using informal sector to collect non-valuable fractions, is not a business solution. It won't come naturally in the market. That's going to need a lot of external financial support, whether that's governments, grants, foundations, regulation, etc. Phoenix Recycling works directly with businesses, so we have the benefit that we can work with them to collect all the components that they have, and we ensure that none of that is disposed of improperly. So we don't have to deal directly with cherry picking with our customers because they do collect all the components. But cherry picking with the informal sector is an issue, which I think Federico can also comment on.
Federico, any final thoughts on this issue?
No, I think it's absolutely right what you said, Luke. I mean, I mean, in the first report we did for the FID, there's already quite evidences on that, and in the junior report that hopefully will be released soon, there is already more insights for Kenya and Rwanda. Off-grid solar recycling, even if we speak only of solar portable lighting and a solar home system without devices connected, it's a cost. And it's a very high cost, in particular because of lithium phosphate batteries and other few elements. So it's the story of e-waste as a business with these products is not working. So it's really, when I said we need to inject some money into the system, and this is why we need to have a system built which is cost effective, because we want always to keep this injection of external money as low as possible, because it's a societal goal. So it's absolutely true what you said. It's not like mobile phones. It's not like with desktop. I have to say there's only very few e-waste products that are proving having to be a business case. For the majority of the e-waste products, we need financial support for sure.
Great, thank you, and thanks to all of you. Thanks, Declan, Federico, Athena, Pragya, for these wonderful insights, for your presentations. I think this is a taster. I'm looking at the clock. It saddens me a bit that we need to wrap this up, but I'm sure this is not the end of the conversation. I look forward to a new year where we can hopefully make further inroads and making sure that this issue is acknowledged more, that there's more awareness, that we're able to find more local solutions, options for downstream fractions, and that we see progress on the policy side as well. I think my final thought, my final comment for all the listeners as well, if you weren't already convinced about why we need to worry about this issue, why we need to talk more about this issue, while we know that energy access is the sector is evolving in a positive way. We see every week now, we see more investment heading into the sector, more products being deployed, governments taking the lead, private sectors taking the lead in terms of actually providing energy access, even though today we still have about 1 billion people lacking energy access. The reason why this issue in particular is actually really important is because we're not actually only talking about the waste that's generated through these solar energy products, but by giving access to energy, giving access to electricity to households, we're actually unlocking further potential e-waste through appliances that all these households will start using. So it's kind of, it is an amplifier. The energy access is amplifying e-waste both through the actual deployment of energy products, but also through the appliances that are being used on these energy products. So that's just a quick takeaway for all of you about why this matters and why we need to square it whenever we say, oh, this matters. No, it matters twice, because the problem is kind of being amplified. Let me end there. Katie, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luke, and thank you again for the panelists for that informative discussion session. For any questions that we didn't have, we were able to answer a lot of the panel attendees' questions during that great discussion. For any that we weren't able to get to, we'll connect with those attendees offline after the webinar. On behalf of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, I'd like to extend a thank you to all of our expert panelists and our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We very much appreciate your time and hope in return that you had some valuable insights that you can take away from your ministries, departments, or organizations. We also invite you to inform your colleagues and those in your networks about the Solutions Center resources and services, including no-cost policy support through our Ask an Expert service. I invite you to check the Solutions Center website if you'd like to view the slides and listen to the recording of today's presentations, as well as previously held webinars. Additionally, you'll find information on upcoming webinars and other training events. We are also now posting webinar recordings to the Clean Energy Solutions Center YouTube channel. Please allow about a week for the audio recording to be posted. And finally, I'd like to kindly ask you to take a moment to complete the short survey that will appear when we conclude the webinar. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at future Clean Energy Solutions Center events. And this concludes our webinar.